The title, Divine Comity, not to be confused with John Milton's Divine Comedy, is another play on the transitive verb form for the verb divine, which we should recall would be any verb that applies its action against or upon an object. And at least the discussion regarding action, verbs, subjects, and objects should be familiar to anyone who has completed and still recalls a grammar school education, finds it relevant to their daily lives. If that seeming tone of contemptuous condescension offends you or me, please feel free to watch some other video more consistent with your scholastic aptitude, or use this opportunity against evolutionary pressure to evolve, improvise, adapt, and overcome in natural selection. Your body and your choice. Hello, and how in hell are you? Exactly, the scientist. How did you arrive and come to this place where we abandon all hope? Ye went to him. You should recognize that quote from somewhere in your literature education. My name is Major Mike Webb. Just another ordinary guy, nothing extraordinary, as you may define. Who do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Well, just having launched what has become my second petition for intervention in a case in the federal courts in another state, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. I have been described by the progressives in the Progressive Voter Guide as having been against the government response to the current public health crisis, and have been described by one federal court in Texas, in the Fifth Circuit, as a litigation hobbyist. And perhaps when you spend your time at home during a pandemic, bringing multiple cases to the United States Supreme Court, like obviously all of us did, that is an apt description, and shall I be such a time. But not for a debilitating depression. I could have done so much more. And this pandemic has been so hard on all of us. Things could be far worse, however. Make like an ice princess and let it go, for the love of God. Divine parenthetic verb transitive comity. What is comity? The Outro Dictionary. Something familiar, something peculiar, something for everyone. Comity tonight. No royal curse, no Trojan horse, and a happy ending, of course. Goodness and badness. Madness. This time it all turns out all right. Tragedy tomorrow. Comity tonight. And perhaps, you had to be a lesbian in high school to even understand that stream of consciousness thought. But if you were to look in a dictionary, that big, gigantic book with the words and definitions in it, you might find the word comity described as a friendly and social atmosphere of gaiety. Quite the opposite of the divisiveness and bickering that has become so much a part of an identity politics. You see every day played out on the news in echo chambers. But a secondary definition applies expressly to religion, denoting an avoidance of proselytizing members of another religious denomination, a restraint, a freedom from, as one trespass case in the Commonwealth of Virginia had described as proselyting pressures from those spreading their particularly religious corporate messages, in a case in which a Jehovah's Witness preacher in Richmond had believed it was his duty under a great commission to deliver a message just as much as it was a duty of a man delivering a telegram for Western Union. Do you have that type of religion? Well, he certainly did. And intriguingly, the history of the United States in the courts suggests that the criminalization of what had once been the purely civil tort of trespass, the police would not come to arrest you, just before 1930, had been passed by state legislatures in response to an evangelical revival in the Jehovah's Witness denomination. This revival of Jehovah's Witness actually actually came after the 1920s, or around the 1920s, when many thought that the rapture was coming. They were standing outside the doors waiting to go to heaven, which didn't happen. But they still had a revival spirit and started knocking on people's doors to get them ready. And there was an equal response in the law. And the state legislatures in 1933 had begun just passing these laws. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, notwithstanding. And at least in historical coincidence, in response to evolutionary pressures and an increasingly secular society, there are fewer complaints about Jehovah's Witnesses these days knocking on doors. People tend to react to them. You have a response of fright or flight. And obviously, some of these people have decided to go someplace else. Comity sounds a lot like religious tolerance. Comity, religious tolerance. Are they the same? What had once been practiced in the colonial period in Maryland under Roman Catholicism. And to be Catholic literally means to be tolerant, but which is more akin to a willingness to put up with your foolishness, like in holy marriage, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, in devotion to a higher duty of Christian love that gave a fuller expression during the publication of Vatican II that ushered in a spirit of ecumenicalism, finding a common ground among core Christian principles, in that case in the Nicene Creed, the doctrines and ideas. However, comity extends just a little bit beyond this concept of tolerance, so as to impose a restraint from attempts to sell your particular brand of religion, prescribing the peddling of your, shall we say, illicit quantities of God. No place for you at the market. And many secularist organizations with an increasing political presence and voice, like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, supporters of Virginia Congressman Don Beyer, who is personally proud that his 4 children have rejected God, church, and religion, express a belief that religious people and organizations and leaders should refrain from their proselytizing, but yet while granting to themselves full range in free speech to promote their message, subordinating your First Amendment guarantee of freedom from prohibitions against your religion and devotional practices, carving out almost an exclusionary monopoly in the marketplace of ideas, which arrangement should sound in your, liberation theology or what have you, a little uneven in distribution, or inequitable, or non-inclusive, non-diverse, to use the popular terms of the day, with your rainbow flag outside your church and Black Lives Matter sign. And you look like an intelligent person. And this spirit of animus that appears like many find in abusive relationships, a timidity by those so victimized, seeking their sense of validation and worth from those who are dictating the terms of the relationship, was the impetus and rationale for going to court during a pandemic against the government response, including the most recent petition to intervene divinely in the litigation recently commenced by the states of Missouri and Louisiana against several federal government agencies for violations of what has been described generally as the First Amendment, but has been directed mainly to those constitutionally guaranteed liberties in free speech, not quite extending to those first liberty grants dating back to the Virginia statute for religious freedom, upon which language we find our First Amendment model. The first openly Roman Catholic president did not claim to have grown up in black church. But when preparing to depart his role as a United States Senator for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has suggested with great eloquence and style and oratory, which became his signature man from Camelot. That he spoke neither from false provincial pride nor political artful flattery. Regarding his Commonwealth of birth, proposing that no man about to enter high office in this country can ever be unmindful of the contribution that state had made to our national greatness, proffering that its leaders had shaped our destiny long before the great republic was born. Its principles had guided our footsteps in times of crisis as well as in times of calm. Its democratic institutions had served as beacon lights for other nations as well as our sister states. And he put forth the proposition that what Pericles had said of the Athenians long before was true of that commonwealth. We do not imitate, but we are a model of others. However, in a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, it was not from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or even this cradle of precedents as leading cases in defense of religious freedom were brought all the way to the nation's highest court. And rather in Virginia, the birthplace of religious freedom, most churches had declared themselves non-essential before the very first lockdown orders commenced on March 15th, 2020, when there were only 45 cases in the entire state and one fatality, in fear from a dreaded novel coronavirus. A novel coronavirus about which, according to recent news from the recently infected Dr. Anthony Fauci, who had once called himself the leading infectious disease control expert in the nation, which is actually the job of the CDC director, is now more willing to discuss and consider keeping an open mind regarding its possible origins in a laboratory, walking back his repeated earlier confident statements in a week in which he has also abruptly decided to retire before the end of the current administration, perhaps to spend more time with family. And at least grammar school science suggests from Newtonian principles of physics that for every action there is what? An equal and opposite reaction. In biology, evolutionary pressure, dictating that one improvise, adapt, and overcome, or cease to propagate and exist. And even in litigation, the strong survive and the weak perish. So let's use this as a segue to discuss the current intervention case, divinely brought under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 24. But let's skip forward to the Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 26 first, which may be more topical with recent news stories about what is described by attorneys as spoliation of evidence regarding what has been described as cell phone text messages from the Secret Service for a potential defendant party to litigation, not necessarily a potential witness, has a duty to preserve material evidence. Perhaps some intend to sue the Secret Service or charge them with some crime, but under which they should have anticipated, but except as exempted by Rule 26A 1B or as otherwise stipulated or ordered by the court, a party must, without awaiting a discovery request, yes, a duty, provide to the other parties the name and, if known, the address and telephone number of each individual likely to have discoverable information. A rule of pre-discovery that identifies potential witnesses who have a duty to preserve material evidence. And a recent news report has indicated that a subpoena requesting discovery from several prominent persons has been issued by the federal court in Louisiana, Western District, to obtain information regarding suppression of free speech by persons like Dr. Fauci, who as a potential defendant, who should have known he may have been a potential defendant, would have had a duty to preserve evidence and would therefore be subject to federal felony charges brought under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, which provides that whoever knowingly alters, destroys, mutilates, conceals, covers up, falsifies, or makes a false entry in any record, document, or tangible object with the intent to impede, obstruct, or influence the investigation or proper administration of any matter within the jurisdiction of any department or agency of the United States, or in relation to or contemplation of any such matter or case, shall be fined under this title, imprisoned not more than 20 years or both, and a court under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6 ALP has a duty to convene a grand jury when this type of information of public interest comes to their attention. Now, under Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances, or FACE Act, 18 U.S.C. Section 248A2, whoever by force or threat of force or by physical obstruction intentionally injures, intimidates, or interferes with, or attempts to injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person lawfully exercising or seeking to exercise the First Amendment rights of religious freedom at a place of religious worship, not just an abortion facility trying to get your abortion, shall be subject to the penalties provided in subsection B. And the civil remedy, you have a civil right of action provided under subsection C. And even though many faith leaders closed their places of worship voluntarily before any order was issued, in December 2020, former Virginia Governor Ralph Northam had conceded that he could not legally limit in-person worship ceremonies, noting that the recent Supreme Court decision against the state of New York, who had brought suit, prevented him from doing it. So, thinking like a lawyer, did Dr. Northam, by force or threat of force, intimidate or interfere with your lawful right to exercise your right to religious freedom at a place of worship? Think about it. Let's consider Dr. Fauci's recent evolution on a possible laboratory origin and the felony charges that may be brought against anyone who had been found to have concealed, covered up, or falsified material facts, to include the known fact broadcasted by CNN in late January 2020 that a snake had been suspected to be the zoonotic source of the novel coronavirus, which the nation's leading infectious disease control experts certainly knew or should have known would be a sharp departure from nature, because coronaviruses only infect mammals and birds and not reptiles like snakes. Something suspicious. Was Fauci not aware of this medical fact, or did his trusted voice in the pandemic conceal this material fact from the American people and the president for some as yet unarticulated reason? Did Dr. Fauci consistently maintain that the novel coronavirus had been zoonotically evolved? But even over 2 years later, this zoonotic source, beyond reports as a possible snake origin, has been identified and has yet to be identified. And Christian G. Anderson of Pew Research Center, who had authored the definitive zoonotic evolution report, as some recall, began to backtrack his statements in September 2021, very, very quietly, joining with over 20 other scientists who had agreed that failure to comprehensively investigate the zoonotic origin through collaborative and carefully coordinated studies would leave the world vulnerable to future pandemics arising from the same human activities that have repeatedly put us on a collision course with novel viruses. Imagine this. You have something that set off a global pandemic. You haven't identified it. So guess what? It's a walking biological warfare laboratory, ready to set off another zoonotic evolution amongst its friends, amongst the people that it goes around. It's kind of dangerous, but we haven't identified that in 2 years. But it hasn't, for some strange reason, done what these scientists feared that it should do. Was Dr. Fauci not aware of this metal fact? Or did his trusted voice in the pandemic conceal this material fact too from the American people and the president? On May 7th, 2021, the CDC acknowledged that the infectious dose of SARS-CoV-2 needed to transmit infection has not been established. And even Dr. Fauci conceded on the day that Pfizer COVID-19 countermeasure product, that's what was approved for emergency use authorization by the HHS Secretary on March 27th, 2020, had been approved by the FDA. that in order to develop effective vaccines, it is necessary to determine what he had described, even at the White House briefing, as correlates of protection or immunity, measured in quantifiable serological titas. No, you want to be quantifiable. Define success in quantifiable terms, which medical scientists know can only be determined by establishing the infectious dose that the CDC admits we didn't know on May 7th of 2021, which can be readily determined yet through validation of causation through Koch's postulates, a methodology that science has known since 1870. Was Dr. Fauci not aware of this medical fact? Or did his trusted voice in the pandemic conceal this material fact from the American people and the president? And in March of last year, because this information appeared to be treated as if it was classified information, a FOIA request was presented to the White House, the ultimate original classification authority, to ask a stupid question. It wasn't classified, which escalated to litigation miles after the celebration of Independence Day in 2021, after the White House had not only refused to respond to that FOIA request, but also had refused to provide an explanation as to why it had refused to do so, under a presumptive claim of executive privilege, which, in cyclical argument, could only be put forward if these metrics were classified as a matter of national security. However, under Executive Order 12958, published April 17, 1995, the government could not classify this information unless it owned or controlled the causative biological agent for COVID-19. And under the 2013 Supreme Court case of Association for Molecular Pathology v. Myriad Genetics, Inc., if this information was classified, it would have to have been manipulated or cultivated in a laboratory, a finding consistent with what had been known regarding a potential snake origin back in January, February 2020, and about which Dr. Fauci is consistently, at least until recently reversing, maintained had been a zoonotic evolution. And in our request to intervene in the litigation commenced by Missouri and Louisiana, we are seeking a simple declaratory relief for the government to admit, finally, after 2 years and over 1 million American fatalities, that it, 6 billion worldwide, it had owned the coronavirus that had rocked your fate, placed you in a reasonable apprehension of grave bodily harm or death, and had canceled religious services in what is essentially a protection racket of extortion. This briefing is unclassified. As you were, my name is Peter Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for U.S. Congress. This year, make the right choice, and we shall make America great again. Honest, carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.